emergency bed. The world is underwater. Watch her life slip away. A city in my head. The light blinds the martyr. I feel her broken hands. Don't hold the door. I want the needle sinking in. I wanna feel it. Show me the fall. Confess to me your greatest sins in my hospital bed.
Bobby Sands, when he was sentenced the first time, this would be 1973. I was interned in Long Kesh prison camp, and he actually went past our cage. He was with a friend of mine, Danny Lennon, who was subsequently shot dead by the British Army. Then Bobby, after his release, he had political status when he was in jail the first time. After his release, he was only out a short time. His wife and him had a young son called Jared. And then Bobby was rearrested on an IRA operation, him and several others, and they were each sentenced to 14 years in jail. And of course, by this time, the British government had reneged on an agreement from 1972 that prisoners who were sentenced in relation to the conflict would have political status, or what the British government called it, special category status. They had withdrawn this arbitrarily, and the second time that Bobby went into prison, they told him to strip all his clothes off. He was given a prison number. He was to call the British prison officers sir. He was to do menial prison work, and it was an attempt to criminalise the prisoners and thus criminalise the struggle. That is, make criminal the fact that our fight for freedom, which has been going on for 800 years, was actually a crime, and that the British were right. And we have never accepted that. And the British government knew that we would never accept that, because the first political prisoner to die on hunger strike was Thomas Ashe in 1917. So it wasn't as if the British government were ignorant and didn't know what they were doing, but they set out to brutalise the prisoners, held them in solitary confinement, beat them, kept them naked, deprived light from coming into the cell, hosed them down regularly, forcibly shaved and bathed them, leaving them with cuts and bruises. Prisoners had their teeth knocked out, their noses broken, their eardrums busted, their fingers broken. They weren't allowed fresh air. They weren't allowed to leave their cells, their prison cells, and so they started to spread their excrement on the prison wall, and that was the start of the dirty protest. Bobby was naturally gifted. He was a musician, a songwriter, and he began writing for me poetry and short stories. So he sent them out to me, and I was the editor of Republican News and later An Phoblacht, and I published most of Bobby's prose and poetry in these two newspapers. The conditions that the prisoners were held in were appalling. On top of all the other punishments, the British government illegally introduced a bread and water punishment, so that every time the governor came in and said, "Are you going to wear the prison uniform? Are you going to accept my regulations?" and the prisoner said no, they would be sentenced to 3 days bread and water in solitary confinement. And this was later ruled illegal by the European Court of Human Rights. They failed to break the prisoners. And this went on for 4.5 years, and eventually the prisoners decided to go on hunger strike. It was their last resort to break the issue. I had been visiting Bobby throughout 1980, liaisoning with him. Prior to, there was a hunger strike in 1980, which Bobby wasn't on, but Bobby had become the leader of the prisoners, and I had been liaising with him. And I knew in those half-hour meetings with him that I held in the prison administrative block that I was dealing with an incredible human being. There was this aura around Bobby that he held power in the palm of his hands. He knew what he was up against. He knew what he was doing. And so he devised the hunger strike of 1981, where he would lead it. He would go out front and then be followed at intervals with other prisoners. In the early stages of his hunger strike, an MP, Frank Maguire, in a constituency called Fermanagh in South Tyrone, who was a friend of the prisoners and who supported Bobby and his comrades' demands for political status, he suddenly died. And we didn't plan it. There was a by-election called, and we put forward Bobby as the candidate. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, had said, how can I recognise you? How can I negotiate with you? You don't have a mandate. So we put Bobby up, and Bobby won. It was international news around the world. I was his nominated spokesperson, so I did all the election broadcasts on behalf of Bobby. And it was an incredible election campaign. We were shot at, we were harassed by the RUC, the police, and the British military. They did everything to attempt to minimise the turnout for that election, but Bobby won. The people won. And Margaret Thatcher, instead of using that as an opportunity to negotiate an end to the hunger strike and a settlement of the prison dispute, Margaret Thatcher rushed legislation through the House of Commons, blocking any other prisoner from standing for election, not just in the north of Ireland, but anywhere in the world. And that was in case we put forward one of our prisoners who was held in Europe or in a British jail or in North America in any subsequent by-election. So Bobby was an MP, and still Mrs. Thatcher remained intransigent. And he went to his death on the 5th of May, 1981. It was a horrific time. During that year alone, the British Army and the RUC fired 30,000 plastic bullets at demonstrators, at women and children, and killed children during that awful, awful year. The hunger strike lasted for 7 months. Eventually it ended on the 3rd of October 1981 after 10 men died, and another one of whom, Kieran Doherty, had been elected to the Irish Parliament in Dublin. So the hunger strike ended after 7 months, and within 2 days the British government gave the prisoners what they could have given them at the very beginning. They gave them their own clothes, because it was the prison uniform, this British prison uniform, that symbolised criminal status, and the prisoners got their own clothes. Within the space of a few years, they ran the jail, they organised the jail. The British government recognised the command structures in the jail. And indeed, the political status of the prisoners was recognised in the Good Friday Agreement when the prisoners were given early amnesty. So 40 years later, what do we find? We find Bobby Sands and his 9 comrades and the hunger strike is one of the most epochal moments of 20th century Irish history. For our generation in the north, who experienced discrimination on our parents and grandparents, who fought against it using civil rights, and then when we were repressed, took to armed struggle. For our generation, the hunger strike of 1981 was the equivalent of our 1916. And the inspiration that those prisoners have given to subsequent generations led to huge support for the Republican movement, to the stage that the British government eventually negotiated with the Republican leadership. The prisoners were let out, and within a very short space of time, Sinn Féin had become the main party representing the nationalist community in the north. They had overtaken John Hume's SDLP. And now, we're in West Belfast doing this interview. Now Sinn Féin is the largest party in the north, according to many opinion polls, and it is the largest party and tipped to be in government in the south. So what we could have here, and what I think we will have here in the next year or two, is the Vice President of Sinn Féin, Michelle O'Neill, being First Minister of government in the north, and Mary Lou MacDonald as President of Sinn Féin being on Taoiseach, which is Irish for leader, the leader of the Parliament in the south. And using these positions of power and influence, trying to harmonise social and economic issues on both sides of the border, and eventually, of course, forcing the British government to recognise that there has to be a referendum on the issue of the constitutional future of Ireland. We believe that we are on the cusp of achieving what we have been fighting for and dying for centuries. That is, that the Irish people get to control their own rights at last, and to think that this came out of a prison cell in the H blocks of Long Kesh by men who died on hunger strike. They are heroes, they're internationalists, they are an inspiration to other struggling people around the world, and victory will be theirs. The famous photograph that we know of Bobby and that you see on posters was actually taken in Long Kesh when he had political status. And Bobby was in Long Kesh with other people like Jerry Adams, for example. They were all in the same cage, where there was Irish language, there was discussions on international struggles, on revolutionary struggles around the world, on the meaning of redistribution of wealth, and socialism, and of course Irish radical writings such as James Connolly. So Bobby absorbed all of that. Bobby imbibed all of that, and it informed his subsequent poetry. I mean, if you look at the Rhythm of Time, it talks about, you know, the Spartacus, the uprising of the slaves against injustice. It talks about by my heart, wounded knee, where the Native Americans had their last stand against the European colonist subjugation of their country. So then he brings all of these strands together in that wonderful international poem, The Rhythm of Time. When Bobby came out of jail the first time, I was the editor of Republican News, and he came down to me full of enthusiasm, long hair, hippies, very friendly face, full of enthusiasm, and he wanted to bring out a community newspaper. So we got him ink and paper, etc., and give him advice on how to do that. And Bobby was involved, so he's involved in the local community, he was involved in the tennis association, he was involved in the youth club, he was involved in a folk club, and he was also involved in the Irish Republican Army as a fighting guerrilla. When I next saw him, it was in completely different circumstances. He had long hair, a long beard. The smell of his body, because of course he had been locked up for 3-4 years now, and had not been allowed to wash, not been allowed to get out the ablutions. He, along with hundreds of other prisoners held in these conditions, who, if they went to go to the toilet outside the cell, to the bathroom, they were beaten, and so they were forced to put their own excrement on the prison wall. But I mean, even at that, his mind was totally and absolutely alert. He could summarise situations incredibly fast, and he had the measure of the British government, he had the measure of British imperialism. Even, for example, when the Pope sent an emissary to him saying, "Bobby, please come off hunger strike and I will do this and I will do that," Bobby knew that Thatcher wasn't going to give way. Bobby knew that there was going to have to be a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, his life and that of his comrades, if they were to regain political status, because the stakes were so big. The British government couldn't defeat the IRA on the outside, so it decided to try and defeat the IRA at its most vulnerable. Prisoners, naked, held in solitary confinement, where 6 or 7 prison officers, many of whom were ex-British soldiers, could try and beat them into submission. And the British government thought that if it could beat them into submission, that would demoralise the struggle on the outside. Those were the stakes that we were struggling for back in those days.